how to make some of the panels from the Fairy Castle design from Kreative Kiwi. I'm only doing a couple of the panels because the only difference between them is the amount of colour changes depending on which character you're stitching. And then I will show you at the end how to assemble them all together to create a beautiful height chart. For this I'm going to be using my 5x7 hoop, cutaway stabiliser, a selection of threads, my squizzers, masking tape and my fabrics and batting cut to size. Below this video there is a link to the design and lots of other information, so do take the time to read it, as I'm sure it will answer many of your questions. You're going to start by hooping your cutaway stabiliser, so place it over the hoop and then push your inner frame into the centre. I like to pin around the edge of mine because I find that it stops my stabiliser from being dragged down between the two hoop parts. So just take a pin, and you can use any pins as long as it's got a head on it. Lay it on top of the inner hoop frame, push it through, bring your pin back round and through the stabiliser again, and that will anchor it. Now I'm going to do that on all four sides. And then stitch round number 1, and that's going to give you your batting placement outline. Place your batting over the outline and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 2 to secure it. As you probably noticed, I've got a couple of areas that haven't stitched. That's down to my machine, it's due a service and I can't get it in just yet. So to correct this problem, all I'm going to do is stitch round number 2 again. I've already done this side, I've just got this side to go. You're now going to remove the excess batting. And now we're going to place our fabric over the top. And then you're going to tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 3 to secure it. Next is the markings for your ruler. So change your thread to whichever colour you want for that, and then stitch round number 4. Next is the numbers, so change your thread to whichever colour you want for them. And then you're going to stitch round number 5. And that's how you stitch the measurement panels. They're as easy as that. And you will have noticed that there's 2 parts per hooping as well. The next element of this design that I want to show you is the tags. And you can personalise these through your embroidery machine. I'm going to show you how to do it on mine, but if you're not sure, yours might be slightly different if you've got a different brand of machine. So you'd have to look that up in your user manual. So we're going to start off, this time we're using wash away stabiliser. If you're new to machine embroidery, just as a rough guide for you, if something has an embroidered edge, satin stitch edge, then we use 2 layers of wash away stabiliser. so that once we finish the item we haven't got any what we call pokies sticking through, and pokies are just fibres from stabiliser or fabric. So hoop 2 layers of wash away stabiliser, load the file into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 1, and that's the placement outline for your batting. I will add that I've got my neutral light brown thread and matching bobbin in my machine, because where the edge is going to be embroidered, it's nice to have a matching bobbin so that it's the same colour on both sides. So here we go, round number 1. Place your batting over the outline and secure it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 2 to secure it. Trim away the excess batting. You're now going to place your front fabric over the outline and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 3 to secure it. Next you're going to stitch round number 4, and that's the quilting. We're now going to add some text to the tag. I'm just going to put an age on there. So in my panel here, I'm on colour number 5. I need to bear that in mind for when we come back into the design. So I'm now going to come out of this, and that's centred my hoop. So I'm now going to go into the fonts, and I think I'm going to pick this one. Now, bearing in mind the size of your tag, you have to choose the size of your text carefully, and it may pay you to do a little test stitch first. I found on mine that I need to use the smallest lettering. So I'm going to come into here and I'm going to press the numbers, and I'm going to pick the 6. And down here I've got the size of my text, large, medium and small, so I'm going to press that twice so that it's small. And then I'm going to go into the capital letters, and I'm going to pick the M. Oh no, I've got to go back, sorry. I want to delete, because I want a space first. Okay, so pick the space, then the M, then I'm going to go into the small letters and go O, where's the N, N, T, H, S, and then I'm going to press embroidery, and that's going to send the text to my machine. And if you have a look here at the size of it, it's going to be 7.7 millimeters high by 46 millimeters wide, so just under 2 inches. We're now going to stitch. I just want to show you how big the text would have been had I used medium. It's far too big, and we've got the satin stitch edge that's got to go all the way around, and sometimes less is more. You've now got to make some decisions. If you're using a very narrow velcro, or your velcro isn't quite wide enough, let's turn the hoop over and you'll see what I'm talking about, or your velcro isn't quite wide enough to go past the stitch line, then you're probably better off sewing the strip onto some fabric and then positioning it in place. The problem that I've got here, I can get away with stitching that on, and the zigzagging and the satin stitching will hold that in place nicely. That won't be a problem. But because I've got white, I can see all the stitching coming through. So I'm not using that option today. But you can actually do it. If you had black, there wouldn't be any problem whatsoever because you wouldn't see underneath. And then you just stitch, you tape that in place. I will show you. Let's get some tape. So you would tape it in place. Then using some water-soluble topper, this is a little bit big, but I'm going to cut this down in a minute. Then you tape that in place over the top, and it just helps it slide, and also it helps to reduce the friction on your thread as it's stitching, because this is quite rough. But you shouldn't have any problems with thread breakages and things like that. I found that this prevents all that. So I'm going to remove this. I'm going to put my fabric over the top. Now most of this fabric is going to be cut away. You're not going to see it. It just makes putting it in place easier. So I'm going to tape that down with some masking tape. And I think I'm going to trim off here and put a bit each side. So I really don't want it shifting while I'm stitching. I'm going to put my water-soluble topper over the top. Just stick that in place with some tape. And I just want to remind you that this is the way that I do things. There's lots of other ways that you can go about it. It's entirely up to you, but this is my preferred, tried and tested method. Okay, so I'm now going to pop my hoop back into my machine, and we're going to stitch round number 5 to secure the backing. I'm just going to add that I've changed my thread back to the light brown as well, and I've put my matching bobbin into my machine. We're now going to trim up all the excess fabric from the front and back of the hoop, so turn your hoop over, and I'm just going to tear this off. This is the solvy topper. I'm just going to leave what's in the middle, and then I'm going to trim up all around the edge. Making sure that you've got your matching bobbin and thread in your machine, you're now going to stitch round number 6, and that's going to do the satin stitch around the edge. So you've removed your hoop, turn it over, and we're going to remove the solvy now, and it literally just pulls off. So that's revealed all your velcro. That's nice and rough and ready to stick. So we're now going to free this from the hoop. So I've got my scissors, run them round the edge, taking care not to cut the stitching. And all that remains on this is to get rid of the excess stabiliser. So I've got a glass of warm water and a cotton bud. Dip your cotton bud in the water and run it around the edge. And that's the tag finished and ready to use on your height chart. You're going to start by hooping your cutaway stabiliser. So place it over the hoop and then push your inner frame into the centre. I like to pin around the edge of mine because I find that it stops my stabiliser from being dragged down between the two hoop parts. So just take a pin, and you can use any pins as long as it's got a head on it. Lay it on top of the inner hoop frame, push it through, bring your pin back round and through the stabiliser again, and that will anchor it. Now I'm going to do that on all four sides. Load your file into your machine. I'm going to be stitching out the princess for this stitch along, and then you're going to stitch round number 1, and that's going to give you your placement outline. I've got a neutral colour, this one, loaded into my machine for this. Place your batting over the outline and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine, and that's going to secure your batting in place and give you your placement outlines for your fabrics. Trim away the excess batting from around the edge of the stitch line. You're now going to place your castle fabric over the largest box, and you're going to place it face upwards, and I'm just using a little bit of tape to hold it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 3. Next is the quilting, and that's going to form the block work of the castle walls. So you're now going to stitch round number 4. You're now going to stitch round number 5, and that's going to give you your placement outline for the fabric for the window. Place your window fabric over the outline and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 6 to secure it. You're now going to trim away the excess fabric from around the window. Pop your hoop back into your machine and stitch round number 7, and that's going to zigzag along the raw edge. Load your thread for the window quilting into your machine. I've loaded cream into mine, and then you're going to stitch round number 8. Load your thread for the princess's dress into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 9. Next is the dress detail, so I've loaded a different blue into my machine. Then you're going to stitch round number 10. Next is her skin on her face and her hand. So load a flesh coloured thread into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 11. Change your thread to the colour that you want for the hair, and then you're going to stitch round number 12. Change your thread colour for the crown, and then you're going to stitch round number 13. Next is the eyes and mouth, so change your thread to an appropriate colour, and then you're going to stitch round number 14. We're now going to do the stonework around the window, so load an appropriate colour into your machine. I'm using a light brown, and then you're going to stitch round number 15. Next is the detail around each of the stones, so load an appropriate colour into your machine. I'm using a reddy brown, and then you're going to stitch round number 16. Load your flesh tone back into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 17, and that's going to be for the hand. Load your hair colour into your machine again, and then you're going to stitch round number 18, and that's her ponytail. We're now going to add the sky fabric, so you're going to place your fabric over this stitch line here with your fabric facing down, so right side down. Make sure that it crosses the line there, and then you're going to tape it in place. I've loaded blue thread into my machine, and that's the colour that I'm going to be using for the stippling over the sky. It just saves some colour changes then. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 19. If you're new to machine embroidery, the technique that we use for joining more than one fabric to the hoop is called flip and stitch. So you place your fabric down, you stitch it, then you flip it up the right way. So flip your fabric over, and I'm just going to finger press that join, and then add a bit of tape to hold it in place on the sides. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 20. Next is the stipple quilting over this area here. So make sure you've got the right colour thread loaded into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 21. Next you're going to stitch the ivy vine, so change your thread to green, and then you're going to stitch round number 22. Change your thread for the butterfly, and then you're going to stitch round number 23. Next is the little bird, so change your colour for that, and then you're going to stitch round number 24. Load a darker colour into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 25, and that's going to do the detail on the bird. And lastly, load your neutral thread back into your machine and stitch round number 26. And that's your princess panel finished. You're now going to stitch the other characters, and they're all done in a similar way. The construction of the panel is identical, it is only the features and characters that change. I'm now going to show you how to do the roof. Hoop and pin your cutaway stabiliser. Load your roof file into your machine, and you want to put a thread colour that you're going to use for the stippling on the sky into your machine as well, and then you're going to stitch round number 1, and that's going to give you your batting placement outline. Place your batting over the outline and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 2, and that's going to secure your batting in place. Trim away the excess batting. Place your largest piece of sky fabric over this area here, and you want it to come past these 2 stitch lines there, because that's going to be where the joins are. Then you're going to take your castle fabric, place it face down on this side of your sky fabric, and as you can see, it overlaps this stitch line. We can now tape that in place, and you're going to pop this into your machine and stitch round number 3, and that's going to secure it all. Flip the castle fabric back on itself and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 4 to secure them. Change your thread for the one you're going to use for the castle quilting. I've changed mine to light brown, and then you're going to stitch round number 6. Place your second smaller piece of sky fabric face down over this stitch line here and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 7 to secure it. You might want to put your sky stippling thread back into your machine for this. Flip your fabric up and finger press the crease. Pop a little bit of tape at the top. Pop your hoop back into your machine and stitch round number 8, and that's going to secure this fabric in place. Next you're going to stitch round number 9, and that's going to stipple all over this area. Round number 10 is going to give you your placement outline for your roof fabric. Place the fabric for your roof over the outline that you've just stitched and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 11 to secure it. You might want to change your thread colour to the colour you're going to have for the satin stitching around the roof edge. I'm going to carry on with the blue so that you can see what I'm doing. Trim away the excess fabric from around the roof. Load whichever colour you're going to use for your roof into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 12, and that's going to do the quilting. Next you're going to stitch round number 13, and that's going to do the satin stitch around the edge of the roof. And that's it as far as the construction of the roof panel goes. From this point on, all you're doing is thread changing colours as you did for the princess panel. So round number 14 is going to be the ivy vine. Change your thread to whichever colour you want your fairy wings, and then you're going to stitch round number 15. Change your thread to the colour you want for her flesh, and then stitch round number 16. Change your thread to the colour for her dress, and then stitch round number 17. Change your thread to the colour you want for her hair, and then you're going to stitch round number 18. Change your thread to the colour for the bird's body and stitch round number 19. Change your thread to a contrasting colour for the bird's features and details, and then stitch round number 20. Change your thread to red for the body of the ladybird, and then stitch round number 21. Change your thread to black for the head, and then stitch round number 22. Change your thread back to neutral, and then you're going to stitch round number 23. And that's all the stitching complete. We can now remove this from the hoop. And that's the roof finished. You now have everything you need to be able to stitch all the panels for the whole project. So next we'll go on to joining all the pieces together to turn it into a height chart. So we're going to start off by trimming up the excess fabric from around the edge of our panel. I'm going to leave myself a 1 centimetre seam allowance for this. So I'm going to take my rule, measure to the outside stitch line, place it up against it, and then with my rotary cutter I'm just going to cut that off. And I'm going to do exactly the same on all 4 sides. And you're going to do exactly the same on all of your fairy castle panels. You're now going to join them all, and I'm going to show you how to do one, and you're going to do all the rest in exactly the same way. The only one that's important order wise is that your roof goes at the top. So I've already stitched these together, and we're now going to add this one to this one. So take your panel, place it face down over the one underneath, and then you're going to pin it. Now there's 2 stitch lines, and this time you're going to pin it to the inner one. So the easiest way is to take a pin, push it through the corner stitch, do the same on the one underneath and push your pin right through. Then go over to the other corner and do exactly the same. And make sure that your sky is lined up as well, because you don't want that to have a step in it where it's out of alignment. So just take the time to line that up as well, and then pin. Then you can take your marker pins out of the way, and you'll know that this is going to line up, this edge here is going to line up, and so is your sky fabric. So once you've done that, you're now going to stitch all the way across here, and you're going to stitch a hair's width inside the inside stitch line. And there it is. Okay, once you've done that, you're going to want to press your seams apart so that when you come to join your other pieces, you're reducing the bulk along where the joins are. We're now going to do the same with our tape measure. You're going to trim up around the sides, and then as there's two pieces to each hooping, we're now going to cut it straight down the centre along that centre stitch line. And then we're going to do the same on the seams. Just line up the stitch line and just trim it off. Oops, I didn't cut that very straight, did I? And the same along here. And these are going to join nose to tail the same as the other pieces. You want to align this stitch corner here with this stitch here, because that's going to fold back and you still want this stitch line showing. So you're going to pin it and join it so that when you open this out, you've still got that stitch line. And if you do it nice and accurately, your tape measure will be accurate as well. So we're now going to do exactly the same. Now, I'll be honest, when I do these, I prefer to baste them together rather than just pin, because I find it far more accurate. And it doesn't take long to run a needle and thread through it. Now, if you line these up as well, everything will sit squarely. Move my pins over here where I can reach them. So I'm pushing them through here and through the same point on the one on the back. It's just to hold them in place while I line up the important part, which is the top stitch line. Okay, so now I can just push this one through this corner, and I know that that's all going to sit nice and square. Now pop a couple of pins through. And I can remove all the others now. And that will all line up beautifully when we come to stitch it. Now, as I said, I actually based mine together, so here's some I've done with the other pieces, and you can see that you can get it nicely lined up, ready for stitching. Okay, so this piece will join onto this piece. The two corners. Now I'm going to do the same here. To hold that one nice and square. I can just put my pins in now. It's on the other side. Now you're going to be stitching from the side that's got the thicker of the lines, and that's because you want to make sure that you're literally a hair's width to the side of that line, so that when you open it out you haven't covered it. Okay, so when I stitch, I'll be stitching just this side of that line, following it as closely as possible. Let's remove these placement pins, and that's all now ready to stitch together. So once you're done, you'll have something that resembles these. If you find that you want to extend the length of your panel, what you can do is stitch out some bottom pieces, but without the character and the window. I just stitched the brickwork, the sky and the vine, and added that onto the bottom, because these pieces are not going to be exactly the same as, or same length should I say, as these pieces. So you will either have to trim or extend. It's entirely up to you which one you do, of course. So now that we've done these, we're now going to add, or should I say, we're going to prepare our pieces with velcro on them. In between the castle and the measure, well actually each side of the measure, I'm going to add a piece of sashing with some velcro on it, because this is going to be a measure for 2 children. So I'm going to have one with the indicators going that way and one with the indicators going that way. So we're going to, what I've done is I've cut a strip of fabric 4 inches wide by just over the total length of my castle runner. And I've done that twice. I've also got a piece of velcro, and I'm going to attach that down the middle, and then I'm going to be stitching it to the fabric. So for the sashing, I've got a strip of batting cut the same width as my fabric, 4 inches, by over the length that I'm going to need. I'm going to place my sashing strip up the right way, of course, onto the batting. And then I'm going to place my velcro in the middle of that, and I'm going to pin it. The batting's going to make up the thickness that's lacking on the sashing, so that it's the same thickness as all the panels that we've stitched, and it's going to give it a bit of body as well when it comes to attaching the velcro. And I'm just eyeballing this. You can measure if you want to. Okay, so now we're going to sew down one side and then back up the other, and that's going to hold it all together. The next step is to add the measure to your sashing. If you're only putting one piece on, you'll only do this once. If you're going to have a piece each side, like I'm going to have, you're going to do it twice. So you have to make a decision about the height of your measure, because it's going to be longer than your actual castle runner. So if I want the height, I'm going to line up the top first, and then I'm just going to pull this down so that you can see. Oops. You'll see here that it's longer here. So eventually I will be cutting this off here. So my measure will start at 40 rather than 30. You need to decide whether you want the height or whether you want to, which end you want to start basically. So I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to move this one out of the way for a minute. So place your measure face down, line it up to the edge of your fabric. So I've got raw edges to raw edges, and then you're going to pin it in place. And we're now going to stitch that one in place. We're going to be stitching virtually on top of the dark green line there, but I'm just going to keep it to the right hand side slightly, so an absolute hair's width to the right. I'm now going to add the measure to my other piece of sashing, so I'm going to turn that over and once more pin the raw edges to the raw edges. Okay, so I'm now going to stitch this, and this time I'm going to be following this stitch line here all the way down. If you're worried about wiggling off when you come to your pressed seams, you can always draw a line down there that you can follow. We're now going to join our castle panels to the height measure. So I'm going to line up the top here and the raw edges, this raw edge here to this raw edge here. So turn it over so you've got right sides together, and then I'm just going to pick this stitch line here and bring it just slightly above that one there, and then pin. We're now going to stitch this, and we're going to stitch just to the right of this inner stitch line here. So turning it round, it will be just to the left, and that's the direction that I'm going to be sewing in. Now we've got all our parts joined, we're going to trim up all the edges and make sure that they're all nice and straight and square. I've done the two longest edges, and I'm going to show you on the two shortest, but you do exactly the same on all sides. So we're going to take this, and I'm just going to fold it up a little bit so that it's not too bulky, and then I'm going to take my cutting rule and lining it all up at the bottom with this inner stitch line. I'm going to trim it all the way across, and I'm going to make sure that I keep everything nice and square. So that's the bottom edge done. Now I'm going to do the same with the top edge. And take your time, get it nice and square. So that's the top edge and the bottom edge all trimmed up. Next we've got to think about how we're going to hang this, and on mine I've decided that I'm going to recycle one of these plastic packaging hangers. So what I've done is I've got a scrap of fabric, and this is going to match my sky. I folded it over. I've got some thin batting here, and what we're going to do is, I'm going to put this aside a second. I'm going to take this and I'm going to measure from the inside of each side, and I'm going to mark it off. So, and I want it just slightly less than the curve. So I'm going to turn that round, and using my square, my quilting ruler, I'm going to mark off along the 2 marks, and I'm going to cut it just slightly wider. I'm just leaving myself 2 centimetres on the seam allowance. I'm trimming mine up now so I can explain to you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stitch along these 2 lines, and this eventually will double over so that it wraps around. Once it's hemmed, of course, it wraps around nicely around my hanger so that it can be hung up. So what I'm doing is I'm going to put my batting over the back, and I'm just going to stitch down. It doesn't matter which side I do this, but if I do it the other side I can see my lines, which might help. So I'm going to stitch down each of these, then afterwards trim up the edges, and then I'm going to, this will form a pocket, then it will be folded out the right way, and then this will be this end here will be tucked into the seam of the backing on the height chart, so it will be all nice and neat, and obviously there won't be raw edges because they will be tucked under. And then I will use cam snaps along here so that it wraps around my hanger, and then if I want to take it down and wash it, I just unsnap it and it's ready to throw in the wash. So we're going to stitch that in a minute. The other thing that you want to do is cut out a piece of fabric the same size as your height chart, so edge to edge, top to bottom, because we're going to be stitching that in place next as well. So for now I'm going to stitch this because we're going to need to include it when we add the backing on to the height chart. And now for the other side. I'm now going to trim up the edges, and I'm going to leave 1 centimetre . Okay, and now I'm going to turn this out the right way. Now you may need to shape your corners a little bit, and I'm going to do that. I'm just going to cut at an angle there just to reduce any bulk. I'm not bothered about the bottom edge because that's all going to be hidden. And I'm now going to press that so that it lays nice and flat. So now when I come to add my cam snaps eventually, that's all nice and neat. And I've got plenty of length to play with. I can trim that down to any length that I decide afterwards. I might only want, you know, a couple of inches there maybe, so I trim the rest off. So, but that's to decide in a minute. I've marked the very centre of my hanger. I just folded it in half, put a little mark at the top, then with my quilting ruler I just drew the line. And we now need to decide how big we want this. So I've got my hanger here and I'm just going to fold this over, and I think that that's a good size. So I'm going to trim off, I'm going to mark off first and then trim off the excess. So allowing a little bit for seam allowance that's going to be sewn into here. I'm just going to mark that off there. Remove this for a minute, and then I'm going to trim it up. So once more, keeping everything nice and straight. So I'm just going to pop that aside there. Now you need to mark the centre of your height chart. So what I did is I folded this in half. I'm going to lose 1/4 of an inch for seam here, and I'm going to be stitching along this line here. So I've just folded these together, and it just so happens that the centre happens to be on the stitch line here, the join here, sorry. So now I'm going to place this with the centre line to the centre of my height chart, and I'm just going to pin that in place. Now these are only going to be temporary pins because I'll be taking them out once I've added the backing fabric. That's just to hold it for a minute. Okay, next, once you've cut your backing fabric to size, you're going to place it face down over the top of your chart, and you're going to pin it in place. This is so big, it's difficult to get it accurate on camera. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins in just to hold it while I square it all up. And I'm going to go to the other end, make sure that it's square to that as well. And then pin it. And I'm going to pin it from this side, because this is the side that I'm going to be stitching. I'm going to be following this stitch line here. So I'm pinning it from the back. The other thing that we have to think about is leaving an opening so that we can turn this afterwards. So you need to decide where you're going to do yours, and you need to leave about 4 inches or so. And I think I'm going to do mine on this edge afterwards. In fact, no, I'm going to do it on this side. So I'm going to put my pins in. And this is going to be my opening. So I'm going to put 2 pins, and that's the marker where to start and where to stop. And now I can go all the way around the edge, just pinning the backing in place. made sure that as I went through here that I removed the pins that were holding my hanger part in place as well, because I don't want to stitch through and not be able to remove the pins or them get caught in my machine where I can't see them. We're now going to stitch this all in place and remembering to our start and stop points. Before we get going, I just want to explain a couple of things. If you've got a walking foot, then it's well worth putting it on. If you haven't, it's well worth getting one. We're going to be stitching not between the two sets of 2 pins. We're going to start here and we're going to be stitching a hair's width inside this stitch line here, so that both these stitch lines are hidden once we finish stitching. And we're now going to turn this out the right way. So I've turned it all the right way and I've checked that I'm happy with everything all the way around, but I still haven't finished this yet. I need to clip the corners so that they sit nicely rather than being bulky. So what I'm going to do is find my opening. I'm just going to poke each corner through one by one. And now I'm just going to cut across on the diagonal, taking care of course not to cut the stitching. Now when I push that back through, all being well, I should have nice tight corners. I'm just going to put my scissors into there so that I can push it all out. And that's much neater. So that's that one. Now we're going to do the next one. And use my trusty scissors once again to push the corner out. So that's one end done. Now I'm going to do the other end. And that's good enough for me. Okay, so I'm now going to press this, make sure that all my seams are nice and flat and where they should be. So it's all pressed now and sitting properly. All that remains to do is to stitch this up and then add the cam snaps to the hanging part. So I've got enough tail left over from stitching around the edge to be able to use that, and I'm just going to do a little slip stitch along there. And hopefully by the end of it it'll be virtually invisible. So that's all stitched and pressed, and that's all you can see of it. All that remains for us to do now is put the snaps onto the hanger. So I've got my cam snap tool and the two parts here. You've got the spiky button, and there's one for each female piece, and I've also got one for each of the male pieces because they're in pairs. Then I've got my marking tool and my sharp stabby tool that I'm going to use to make the holes to put the spikes through. So we're going to start off measuring the width of your hanging fabric, and what I've done is measured. I've taken 1 centimetre off each side and then put a mark, and then I've realigned my ruler and then done a mark equally spaced out between the two outside ones. So that gives me space for 5 snaps. Next, what we're going to do is create the holes to push them through. So I'm going to push my tool through and just pull on it a little bit so that it stretches the hole. I'm going to do that for all of them. I might have to redo it as we go, but we'll see. Okay, so that's showing through on the back nicely. Then we're going to take one of the buttons with a spike, and as this is going to, let me just show you, as this is going to fold over and snap to close, we're going to have the snaps on the inside, so on the back of this. So I'm going to push the spike through from the front, and then it doesn't matter which side you have the male or female, as long as you have they end up in pairs so that they can close. So we're going to start off, I've got the females here, and then you take your tool. I'm just going to turn this a bit, it's ever so big. Take your tool, and the button sits in the black cup, and either the male or the female part sits in the top. So push that in, make sure that it's properly aligned, like that. And then you squeeze, and that's set. If you don't quite do it the first time, you can do it second, as long as you get it in the cup properly. Now that is not going to come out. So now I'm going to do the same with the others. So that's the first 5 fixed. So now we fold this over and we need to align, make the holes in the centres of these ones. And if you push your tool through, you can actually feel them, so it's not as hard as it might seem. And I'm going to put them in as we go so that I know that they stay nicely aligned. So the spike this time once more goes through on the right side, and then the male piece sits on top, and then the button in the cup and the male part into the top. And that is the snap in place. So now that that's snapped, I can feel the centre of this one. So that's all my snaps attached. So now all that remains to do is take my hanger, feed that through and snap it in position. And there it is. That's our height chart all complete. I hope you enjoyed this stitch along. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to be notified of new videos as they're published. Do pop along to Kreative Kiwi's Facebook group. There's lots of ideas and inspiration there for everybody. And thank you very much for joining me.